All right, Boker Tov. Today's daf is daf Mem Gimel 43. We pick up at the very bottom of Mem Bet Amud Bet, and we're sort of on a little bit of a digression, which is only slightly that the pasuk we're going through darshaning the psukim, and the question is why does it say V'hemit ish o isha, which I don't have written there. After here it says V'hemit Kigasher isha v'mei, and it's Onodak isha kum tvosh Hashem V'hemit ish o isha. Why do you have to repeat ish o isha? And Rabbi Akiva said it's to tell you that look, first, the people here are dead. So who are you paying the kofar to? You're paying it to the heirs, and the same way you would pay it to the descendants of the man, you pay it to the descendants of the woman. And the chiddush there is you don't pay it to the husband, even though the husband normally inherits his wife. So the Gemara says, well, it's because this debt comes after the woman is dead, and therefore the husband only inherits his wife in terms of money that she had or was entitled to. We'll see entitled to in a minute when she was alive, because that's when there was that bond. So then when she died, it passed on to him. But money she gets or becomes entitled to after she dies, there's no longer a bond with him. It goes down to her heirs.
She can stipulate in a will or something, right?
Yeah, but wills are different. Well, you can't stipulate in a will something that's going to only come after your death. Anyway, so the Gemara says here at the bottom of Mem Bet Amud Bet, Ubenizikin lo, 3 lines from the bottom, middle of the line, or towards the end of the line. Ubenizikin lo, Rabbi Akiva, would Rabbi Akiva say that a woman's heirs would not collect normal damages, which would be a debt incurred during life. So if a woman was damaged and somebody owed her money, or the owner of the ox owed her money, and then the woman died, where would that money go? So what we've been saying now is that logically it should go to the husband. And Rabbi Akiva would agree that in that case it would go to the husband. It wouldn't go to the heirs. But is that really true? Vatan, we talk about Brisa. Hika et isha v'yatsu yiladeha. The case in the Torah, a man smote a woman and she miscarried. Nosing nezek v'tzar l'isha utmei vlados labal. So the nezek and the tsar goes to the woman. She's the one that actually suffered the injury and the pain.
And the rest of it too.
And the rest of it too, right? Boshet, whatever, exactly. But the one thing the Torah makes clear is that the payment for the fetus, that goes to the husband. Okay. Ein habal. Now let's say the husband is no longer around when it comes time to pay. He died. No saying liyor shav, you give it to his heirs. Fine. Ein ha'isha. If the woman is not around, there should be no saying, not no senes. No saying liyor sheha. If the woman isn't around, you give to her heirs. So here's a case where a woman suffered injury in her life. She died, and it says you give to her heirs, not to her husband. What's that about? Okay, I mean, it didn't say that this is Rabbi Akiva's position, but we don't hear anybody arguing. Okay, now, Haisa Shifra v'nishtachara. Let's say it was a different case. We're not going to focus on this, but this is the end of the Braita about a slave that was freed, or a woman who had converted. And Rashi says, and presuming that she and in that case she died. So in that case she died, she's got no heirs. So what happens? So this is money that you owe to a ger, that now the ger is dead, and even property a ger owned would be kol hakodim zacha. Nobody's to inherit. It's hefker. So in this case, zacha, you get to keep the money that you owe. Okay. Anyway, we're not going to focus on that, but we have the problem that why, when the woman dies, do you give it to her heirs and not to the husband if it was a debt incurred when she was alive? So Amar Rabba bigrusha, she's divorced. Okay, Amar Nachman bigrusha, she's divorced. Okay, now we're going to have to ask the question: when was she divorced? Rashi says at least initially we're talking about that she got divorced after the injury occurred. Okay, when the injury occurred, then she was married, so you owed the Dnei Vladot to the husband. Right, because that's what the Torah says. He was still the husband at that time. Afterwards, they got divorced. And then, so now you still owe, you haven't paid up your debt, the nezek and the tsar to the woman. She dies. If she dies without being married, then her husband doesn't inherit her, her heirs inherit her. So it all makes sense. Okay. The Gemara says, Amri, bigrusha nami tifluk b'dmei vladot. 1 minute. If it was a case of a grusha, why do you still pay the Dmei Vladot to the husband, right? The Gemara assumes here that the reason the Dmei Vladot go to the husband is somehow because it's sort of like somehow through the wife, or because it's a little funny because
it's like she's Masa Yadeh.
But what?
It's like Masa Yadeh.
Something like that.
So to speak.
So meaning, if the Gemara's question was if the nezek occurred after the divorce, why do you pay to the husband? That makes a lot of sense. he's out of the picture after the divorce. Why do you pay the husband? But here, if it occurred before the divorce, the nezek, which is how Rashi sets it up, okay, then why is that such a problem? At the time of the nezek, the husband, they were married. You owed the money to the husband. Why should that change who you owe the money to, right? If they get divorced afterwards. But let's assume the Gemara's question is the nezek occurred after the divorce. So the nezek occurred after the divorce. So the husband should be out of the picture. Why do you owe the money to the husband? So Ami, Rushanami Tifluk with Dmei Vlados, she should get a portion of the Dmei Vlados, or the whole thing. Amar Papa, HaTorah Zochsa Dmei Vlados Labal. The Torah awarded the Dmei Vlados to the husband. Afilu Baal Lebiznus. He doesn't have to be the husband. He just has to be the father. Okay? So even if they had sex out of marriage, right? So in this case, if they had sex in marriage, conceived in marriage, and then got divorced. So, but even, and they just weren't married at the time. But even if they had sex out of the context of marriage, there was never marriage here. Okay? Nevertheless, he is still the father, and it is the father that gets the Dmei Vlados, not the husband. Okay, so even if they were divorced at the time of the nezek, he gets the Dmei Vlados. My time, what's the reason? Amar Kara Kasher Yashit Alav Baal Haisha. It calls him the Baal. It doesn't say. I don't know what other words that the Torah had actually. You couldn't say Isha. Okay, but since it uses the word Baal, which means Boel, as a word that describes husband but focuses on the act of sex, we understand that it means as long as he was the one that had sex with this woman, meaning and conceived the child, it was his child, he's awarded it even if he's not the husband at the time of the nezek.
As to why that is?
Now, well, the question is actually.
To get the father more involved, you don't.
Well, I would say more than that. According to halacha, and I should have checked this out but I can try to check it out and get back to you. But according to halacha, the basic point is that halacha says in the case of divorce, let's say there are already children. In the case of divorce, who does the halacha say the children go to? So the general rule is that the halacha says that the children go to the father, unless the children are very young, like I forget, up to 4 or 5 or whatever, and need the mother. Now, later halacha developed to always basically say you keep an interest, it's the best interest of the child, sort of like adopting a dina de malchus dina type of approach. But according to but the basic assumption had been that they're the fathers. Welcome to the patriarchy, right? It's Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, right? The children are seen as the father's children. Okay, so that presumably is also why the Dmei Vlados are to the father. So the question is, what happens in a case of, a classic case of what are those suits called? Paternity suit, right? What would you have if somebody is the father, but they were never married? Are they also seen as fundamentally his child? Right? I don't know the answer to that. It's one thing to say in the context of a patriarchy, of a legitimate child born in the context of marriage, they're seen fundamentally as the father's children and not as the wife's children. But in a case of conception outside of marriage, right, would it be the same? I really don't know the whole lot.
But these aren't born children.
Right.
You can differentiate between a born child, which is a patriarchy, and an unborn child, because you also have the concept of hierarchy.
That's true. That's a good point. So, but all the more reason that this is a chiddush. This is both out of wedlock, and it's her own body, and we still see it as you award the Dmei Vlados to the father, not the husband, but to the biological father. So it's quite a chiddush, and I do wonder what that case would be. That if it wasn't a woman suing for support for paternity, but it was the man suing for custody. Right, in that case where they had a child out of wedlock, I wonder if the same assumption would play. But it's quite a shocking Gemara. Now, if you want even more shocking, look at Tosfos. Afilu Baal Levi's Nus. Tosfos says, "B'Yushalmi boy, Rabbi Akiva, Baal Imo, Baal Achoto." Let's say the child is a mamzer, and he had sex with a woman he couldn't marry. Okay, Yochel Afu Baal Ha'irayon, Kabbalomar Baal Baal. Oto Sheroy Likos Baal, Yatu Elu Shen Ruin Likos Baal. It has to be at least that it was possible for them to have been a married couple. Okay, so it's the father, but not just the biological father, in a case where it was possible for them to be married. So that's a big chiddush now that the money goes, even if they are not married, just it goes to the biological father. Okay, but that's how we've explained why, if she's divorced, then she dies, the money passes on to the heirs because she's not married to her husband anymore. Back to the Gemara. The Nukma l'Rabba can go in Shagabu Ma'ot, Ulav Nachman can go in Shagavu Karka. We're going to say 1 minute. It's now going to reference a debate that we have elsewhere in Baba Basra about a question of when is something considered roi or muhsan? And this is exactly the idea we used a minute ago for the husband. The principle is that a bechor, a firstborn, gets double portion on the property that was already under the control of the father when he died. But property that came to the father after he died, he does not get double portion. So here would be an extreme example. The father had a lottery ticket, and he won the lottery after he died. Okay, the bechor would not get a double portion. It was only money that was under the father's control. Now, let's say the father had a debt. He had a credit. Somebody owed him money. Okay, and he had the star. He just hadn't collected the debt yet. Would that be? And then the debt was collected or paid after the father died. Would the bechor get double or not? Okay, so so there's a debate here whether it is between Rav and Rav Nachman whether the debt was paid with money or with land. So let's read that. The Amar Rabba Gabu Karka Yeshlo. If they collected land with that debt, then he is considered to have been under the father's possession, even though it was only collected after the father died. It was considered to have been under the father's possession, and the bechor gets a double portion. Gabumos ainlo, but not money.
Why?
And the reason being, well, because you have a lien against land. Land you can't take away. We always knew the land was there.
There's only b'shtar there.
By a star. So we always knew the land was there. And therefore, even when the father died, the debt hadn't been collected. It was like it had been collected. There was a lien on the land, and nobody was stealing. The land wasn't going anywhere. But if you got money, who knew you would have ever been able to collect money off of this thing? And that's like something that's like winning the lottery, not exactly, whatever. That wasn't considered already in your possession. Okay, Rav Nachman says the verse, Gavu mos yeshlo, Gavu karka einlo. No. It says if you collect money, now we're talking specifically that it was a loan. So Rav Nachman says, if you lent $100, and after the father died, he got back $100. We view it as the same $100. It's not literally the same $100. It's not the same bills, okay? But since it was money that was lent and money that was gotten back, you view it as money that was always in the estate, okay? Whereas if it was karka that was collected, that's like a whole other process. It requires getting base involved, the whole thing, and clearly it's something new. Okay, so anyway, that's the debate of whether the bechor would get pishnayim. Why is it relevant here? Because we're assuming the same thing is true about the husband collecting from his wife. Remember we said when money was owed to her after she died, the kofer, he doesn't inherit it. The husband only inherits his wife, property that was under her control at the moment that she died. So here we have an exact case about, let's figure out what exactly constitutes under her control. She was damaged, injured in her life. Money was owed to her. That money is now going to get paid, right, after she died, okay? Because that's what it said. The woman isn't around, and now it's time to pay the money. Well, according to Rabbi and Rav Nachman, based on whether you pay cash or whether you pay karka, should determine whether you view it as if that money was always under her control. So in the case where you're paying, let's say, karka, according to Rabba, and the money was now seen as always under her control, you're right. The husband should inherit. Why did the Breita say her heirs inherited, not the husband? Because it was paid in cash. It wasn't paid in karka. So even though the money was owed before she died, it's not considered to be yet her money for the husband to inherit it if it only gets paid after her death, and paid in a way that based on karka or cash, it's seen as new funds under her control and not money that was always under her control. Yes.
Basically, we're going to address the question is, do you have like an automatic lien on the guy's property for this kofer, or is it just literally entitled?
Well, by normal nezek, you do have an automatic lien. Like it's milvak suva v'tar v'shar damya. By kofer, it gets to the whole question of kufa kapara, and I'm not sure if it would be different or not. So I'd have to check that. Okay, but so the Gemara says, so look, yes, it's true she was owed the money, and you were saying, oh, if she was owed the money, then it should go to the husband. No, not just because she's owed the money doesn't make it under her control, and it might depend between Rav and Rav Nachman. So the Gemara says, Amri, you could say, no, honey, you leave name Rav, I'll leave it to Rabbanan. That debate of Rabbi and Rav Nachman was a debate based on the Bnei Marava, according to the rabbis, which is like meaning a whole position in the Kamma Baba Basra, which we're not doing right now. But they were debating within a certain position that said that fundamentally there's a problem when you collect a loan that was not money yet under your control. And therefore it's a question if the bechor gets double. Ki kami hachad to Rabbi. We're saying here according to Rabbi. Rabbi said whenever you collect a loan after death, it's like the money was always under the control and the bechor does get a double portion. So within the position of Rabbi, that's our question. Rabbi assumes if the money was owed during life, then even if it was paid after death, it's considered like that money was always under the control and the Bechor gets a double portion. And that's why we wanted to know, why would the woman's heirs get it if the money was already owed under life? Okay, so you got the idea? A husband inherits his wife if they are married at the time of death and if the money is under her control at the time of death. In the case of the kofer, that money only becomes under her, only owed to her after, so the husband doesn't inherit. In the case of divorce, so at the time of the death, they're not married, so the husband doesn't inherit. How about money owed when she was alive and paid after her death? Okay, that's the last thing we're talking about. So according to some opinions, it might matter. Was it paid with karka or cash? And based on what it was paid with, it would be considered either to have been under her control, the husband would inherit, or not under her control, the husband wouldn't inherit. And that could have explained this breita. But according to Rebbe, anything that was owed at life, even paid after death, is always considered under her control, and therefore always would go to the husband. Okay, so those are the different possibilities within this issue about the husband versus the wife's heirs inheriting her. Along the way, we had an interesting insight into the Demei Vlados, that it's not about being the husband, it's about being the father. Now the Gemara continues. Amar Reb Shimon ben Lakish, Shur Shehimi says ha'eved shelo b'kavana pater mishloshim shkalim. Okay, now here, remember I told you a while ago to think about whether the paying of kofer and stoning the ox have to come together. Can you have a case if you don't stone the ox, you would still pay kofer? And we actually had a case about that just a little while ago, right? We were talking about when Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi, whoever it was, Rabbi Eliezer, how could you be paying half if the ox is going to get stoned? And Rabbi Eliezer said it was, Rabbi Eliezer says, no, it was nogeach shelo b'kavana. It tried to kill an animal and killed a person. So that was a scenario where you're not going to stone the ox, but you're still going to pay the kofer, okay? Or we had a discussion before about a regel, Shadar Sal Gabe Tinok, right, which wasn't the Kavana. So until now, we've been assuming you can have a case where you don't stone the ox, and if there's a death, you still pay kofer. Now we are going to revisit that question and look at two cases. Number one, the Shloshim Shel Eved. You don't stone the ox, because here it says, right? No, normally you do, but if you don't stone the ox, would you pay the Shloshim Shel Eved? And we're going to go back and look at the case of kofer, which until now we've been assuming they can become separate. What would be? But now we're going to question that. If you don't stone the ox in the scenario, you don't stone the ox, would you still pay the kofer? Yes.
It's also short sitting. Right, is
right.
But
we never directly addressed whether you pay the kofer by the shor itztidin. Right, that was where I first raised that question. Correct. So we never addressed shor itztidin. You don't stone, but the Gemara never addressed the question: would you pay kofer? We would assume yes. Well, maybe it depends. If you gored it on somebody, I would hope the answer would be yes. If somebody else did it, then maybe you're an honest or something. We never really got to the bottom of that. So let's take a look now at what Reish Lakish says. I'm Reb Shimon Lakish. Shur Shehini says Eved Shelo b'Kavana. If we're dealing not with the kofer case, but the Shloshim Shel Eved, and you're not going to stone the ox because it's Shelo b'Kavana, Pater Mishloshim Shkalim, you're exempt. Shenemar Kezer Shloshim Shkalim Yitain LaAdonav V'Ashur Yisakel. They are immediately juxtaposed. Pay the 30 and stone the ox. So they got to come together. Whenever you're stoning the ox, you pay your 30. If you're not stoning your ox, you're not going to pay your 30. Now, I just want to pause and ask us a question. If you had to decide of the two, kofer and the eved, which one should be more linked, that the payment should be more linked to the stoning of the ox? What would you say?
Is that what
you have the case kofer and eved.
Or Shloshim
And Shloshim Shkalim with the eved. Kofer for Ben Chorin and Shloshim Shkalim for an eved. Which one of those, if we're going to link one of those to the goring of the ox, which one? Any thoughts? What? I would say kofer, because kofer means it's a kapara. You're chayav misa. To some degree, you're lying. It's not just damages. To some degree, right? It's actually like it's a pseudo killing the person through your ox. Okay,
But if you say
so-
it's mamona though,
No,
then you
you
can
say-
say
if you
Yeah.
say it's kapara,
saying
Well,
yesterday.
go
What?
for it's become skila of the person.
right? So that's why. I mean, I'm not saying that's why I would think that only in a case which is seen as a case of murder, where the ox murdered the person, where the ox gets skila, maybe that would be only in those cases would you pay kofar. Where shloshim shel eved, okay, is being paid for damages essentially, right? We never call them kofar; it's paid for the monetary loss. So even if you're not going to gore the ox, stone the ox, your ox still caused damage to this person's property. Here's a perfect example. You don't pay shloshim shel eved if the ox gored your own slave, right? It is not because of the loss of life there. It's because of the loss of property of the owner of the slave. So that would be the case I would think would be most unrelated to the stoning of the ox. But interestingly, until this point, we've been assuming you can pay kofar without stoning the ox. Those are the cases we discussed a minute ago. And Reish Lakish is saying, but when it comes to the eved, okay, at least he's not contrasting it. I'm contrasting it. But he says when it comes to the eved, the pasuk puts them right together. And in that case, if you don't stone the ox, you're not going to pay shloshim shel eved.
Don't you find it disturbing that in these cases of nezek, the eved is treated as property?
Of course it's disturbing, yeah. It's profoundly disturbing,
Right,
yes.
okay.
Okay, but thank you for saying that explicitly.
How does this play into the Gemara yesterday about is it a kula or is it a chumrah? We had this whole question.
Right, 30.
And we said it's in kitzvah.
Right.
It's just a kitzvah. It's just
Right.
It's arbitrary, like
Right.
you're saying. So it's not related. It's not related in any sense to kofar. I mean, it's not related in any sense to even
Nezek.
Right, but it's not related to the body of the shore. in
Right,
any sense.
Right, that's true,
That's
yes. Oh, I see, so the
Even
unit
if the
more
shore's
detached
worth
in that
nothing,
way.
the shore's worth
Right,
nothing.
that's true, from that payment perspective, right.
How do you
Okay.
have an unintentional killing?
I tried to kill an animal and accidentally killed a
It
slave.
doesn't have to be. In other words, not goring the slave. It's actually just killing by accident.
Yeah,
Knock
it might have
something
tried
off.
to kill something else, but wound up killing the slave. That's like we had before. It tried to kill an animal and it's accidentally killed a slave. Okay. שנאמר כסף 30 שקלים ייתן לו, הדבר אשר יסכל. כל זמן שאשר בסקילה, הבעל משלמים 30 שקלים. If you stone the ox, you pay 30. אין אשר בסקילה, אין הבעל משלמים 30 שקלים. But if you don't stone the ox, you don't pay 30. I'm a Rabbi. Now, so again, we start with the Eved case. That's seen as more obvious based on the pasuk. Less obvious based on the logic, but more obvious based on the pasuk. I'm a Rabbi. Shor Shemis ben Chorin. Great. Now let's apply that to a case of kofar. If an ox scores a free person, Shelo b'kavana, patra mikofer, exempt from kofar, against things we were saying earlier. Shenemar, hashur yisakel, v'gam be'alav yumat, im kofar yushat alav, v'natam pidonot kol asher yushat alav. Now that is not nearly as closely juxtaposed as the case of Evan. Got a lot of words between them. But nevertheless, it says stone the ox and then pay the kofar. So therefore, there it's also combined. If you stone the ox, you pay your kofar. And if it's going to be a scenario, you don't stone the ox. I understand, but it's not like literally like the exact next phrase. No, it's not. Hashur yisakel the kofar yashit alav. I know, Michael. It is not as closely juxtaposed as kesef shloshim shkalim yitain v'hashur yisakel. You got the two verbs there, one word away from each other. Okay, it's much more distant here. Okay, but if you're not going to stone the ox, you're not going to get kofar. Okay, so we said it so that, as we said, makes more logical sense. But in the Gemara, that's stage 2, and in the Psukim, it's less closely juxtaposed. Okay, Asay Abaye will asks, Hamish Sharias Ploni, Sharosha Ploni. Somebody admits, right? So you're Modeh, you don't have witnesses. My ox killed somebody, or killed somebody's ox. You pay this in your own admission. You're not a motive b'knas. If you say my ox killed an ox, and you're a motive b'momon. So, the admission of an owner in terms of a monetary debt is kameh aided. If you're motive b'kofar, kofar isn't knas. Kofar is kapara. So it's like your motive that you have to bring a korban. Like I did a sin, I have to bring a korban chatas. Okay, so in those cases you pay. Okay, my lav kofar. So you see that but the only thing is, if you admit that your ox gored, are you stoning the ox? No, right? You're not stoning the ox. So you see, here's a case where you're not stoning the ox and you're paying kofar. My lav kofar. Don't you see?
Why are you not stoning the ox?
Because you only stone the ox. Kimisas aban tachmisas ashur. You only stone the ox in a scenario you would stone a human being. You need to have 2 witnesses. You would not stone the ox based on somebody's own admission.
Al piatzmo is the issue.
Al piatzmo. Okay, so the same way you wouldn't execute a person based on their own admission, you don't execute an ox based on the owner's admission. You need to have objective witnesses. Okay, you treat it like a murder trial.
So Oxmo, of course, is the owner of the ox,
I
not the ox
understand.
himself.
So I guess you have an incentive depending on
What?
the value of the
We
ox.
haven't seen it yet. Okay, you're right. It's coming up. We haven't seen it yet.
So
Okay,
you-
but it is very, very clear that that's
So you have an
the case.
incentive based on the value of ox. If your value is more than Shloshim Shkalim, you might as well always say you pay me shortly, because otherwise because you're paying less by paying the kofar.
What's the name?
Meaning it would have been a questionable case, right? You'd rather not have your ox short.
You should
Your
all
ox
be-
Your
stoned more
admission
than
doesn't get you out of it getting stoned. It just doesn't
Okay.
obligate you. Okay, so my love.
I admit it, then 2 witnesses come later,
Yes,
then it still
yeah,
gets stoned.
absolutely. Okay, same way it doesn't get you out of getting executed if you committed a crime.
It's not
Okay,
like making a deal with
but
the
it's only by knas that your admission might get you out of, not by actual
Oh,
execution.
wait, so killing the ox is an oxecution.
Okay, all right, there you go. Yeah, how long were you waiting for that? Mashalim Alpi Atzmo, my love kosher. So here you have a case of admission where you don't have witnesses, so you're not going to stone the ox. Shh. You don't have witnesses, you're not going to stone the ox, but you're going to pay. So you see, you pay kofar without stoning the ox. So the Gemara says, lo dumin. No, in that case, you're not going to pay kofar. What you are going to pay is monetary compensation. Now, this is a huge, big chiddush the Gemara is coming up with, and it's going to stay with us for the rest of the daf to figure it out. If you might remember, from the beginning of the Masechet, I've been pointing out to you that even putting ideas of kimle aside, you never have a monetary compensation for for loss of life, or taking somebody's life. Okay, taking somebody's life is either ritzicha, or you go into galus, or you pay a kofar, whatever, but you don't pay a monetary compensation. What the Gemara here is saying is that might not be true if you didn't kill the person yourself. If you killed the person yourself, then it's never going to be dealt with in terms of a civil suit. It is never going to be compensation. But if your ox kills a person, you might actually be a case where you pay compensation, not kofar. And the Gemara sort of sees this as like an alternative. It's like the fallback position. The first thing the Torah says is you pay kofar. But in a scenario where you wouldn't pay kofar, okay, you would still pay compensation.
What does that mean?
So what's the scenario? So according to us right now, the scenario is if you're not going to stone the ox, and since the kofar is tied in with the stoning of the ox, so if you're not going to stone the ox, you're not going to pay kofar, but you'll still pay monetary compensation, which, by the way, makes a lot of sense, right? The kofar is for being chayav misa, and that's only if you stone the ox. But even if it wasn't so wicked to be chayav misa, you're still responsible for loss of life. So there can still be a monetary payment.
I'm sorry, what is this monetary payment?
So it's the value of the person's life on the slave market. So the question becomes, well, 1 minute, isn't that they have the exact same thing that kofar is? Well, if kofar is demei mazik, it's a different amount. It's the difference between demei mazik for kofar and demei nizak for mammon. But if the kofar is demei nizak, what's the difference? So look at Tosfos. Tosfos says, my love kofar, lo domin. Tosfos says, v'im tomar. Amanda Amar, kofar demei nizak, ma'iga bein damin l'kofar. Either way, you're paying for the value of the person on the slave market. Who cares if you call it kofar, you call it compensation? V'nira l'rit, you go and shemeid hamazik. The ein kapara la'achar misa. K'mo chatas v'asham, the ein b'ayim la'achar misa. Let's say the owner of the ox, of the goring ox, died. If it's compensation, then his estate still has to pay it out. It's a debt he had during life. But if it's kapara, so if a person was machal Shabbos, you don't bring a korban for him after he died. Okay, avodami mishalem. He says it's ironic. When you're doing it as kapara, the actual liability is less than when you're doing it as compensation. Okay, but the kapara aspect comes first. Only when kapara isn't true, because it's like the shore doesn't get ski law, then the idea of compensation kicks in.
Only according to the Demei Mazik. Only if the kofar is Demei Mazik.
Only if the kofar is demei nizak, then you can say that they're fundamentally the same.
Right.
If it's demei mazik, then there could be differences either way, okay? Right. Sometimes you could be paying more with kofar, sometimes you could be paying more with mammon. But depending on who's worth more. Right. But if it's demei nizak, then it's always the same amount.
Why is it always the same?
Because whether I'm paying kofar is demei nizak or paying tashlumim is demei nizak, it's the same amount of money. It's demei nizak. If the amount you pay kofar is the guy's worth on the slave market, and the way you pay compensation is the guy's worth on the slave market, and it's both the same guy, then you're paying the same amount. But Tosfos says, nevertheless, actually, Mammon would actually have a more enduring debt than Kofar. Kofar would only be for the person. Mammon would be on the
I
estate.
thought Kofar was a flat amount, not a
No, Dmei Nizak or Dmei Mazik. You're thinking about Shloshim Shel Evet.
That's
Okay.
correct.
So let's skip.
That's right.
I'm sorry, why is it
let's-
Chamura Shalom Kavan again?
Because Shalom Kavana would be Mammon, and then it would be a debt that would last on the estate even after the guy's death. Okay, if you go 2 lines down in Tosfos, he says, the Od Yesh Lomer, Jadaf Kamine being dumming the Kofer, the dumming Yochel Limchol, the Kofer in Yochel Limchol. That's a great idea. Let's say the surviving family says we waive it. We don't need you to pay us. They could say that if it's compensation, but if it's kapara, it's like I'm sorry, you can't waive it. I still have to do this for my atonement. The Iavi Pshitalan, here's a third possibility. To Kofir Sholim Mamorchman of Lochatzikov. Remember the case of the Shutfim? Do we say each one pays a half or each one pays? Oh, by the way, the Rambam in that case rules that each one pays full. Because it's kapara, each person needs a full kapara. So Tov says that's another nafkamina. So if it was dumming, they would obviously each only pay a half. The partners of the ox that killed, because it's ultimately about getting the guy compensated. But if it's kapara, then each one would pay a full amount. Okay, so fascinating opportunity to look at conceptual differences between kapara and mammon, kofar and mammon. But also what's fascinating is we've been so consistently denying that there's compensation for human life. And here we're saying actually there would be. In a case where there's no kofar, you would actually do compensation. Not when a person killed a person, but when an ox killed a person.
I don't understand about this. So, like, how does that play? I'm trying to understand this theological.
Yeah, I don't know the theological answer. I can tell you the practical answer is that you don't bring a korban for somebody after they die, right? Whether something you do can be a kapara for people, but that's not like an obligation that person or his estate has. Okay, so now the Gemara says,
so it's sort of like, is it like having a civil case in a murder case, right?
Yeah, that's what I've been saying all along, like the O.J. Simpson. But the point is that we're still never going to say that, according to this at least, we're never going to say that by case when a human took a life. But when an ox took a life, okay, then maybe if it's not we're not going to do both, kapara and tashlumin. We're going to start the same way you always start with the criminal, okay? Right. But if we can't do the kapara in this case by the ox, we're going to do the tashlumin. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Okay, so that's how we try to explain. Here's how you could have payment even though you're not stoning the ox. Idom in 1 minute. If it's payment, compensation, back to the Gemara, 5 lines from the bottom. Ema Sefer, let's look at the end of the breakdown. My ox killed so-and-so slave, then that's shloshim shekel. As a knas, you don't do it based on your own admission. Okay? But 1 minute. You're not going to stone the ox in that case because it's on your own admission. So you're not going to pay the shloshim shel evet according to this logic. But you should be paying domim. You should be paying compensation in that case, right? It should follow the same pattern. If you're not paying the special, the arbitrary thing, what the Torah says, because you're not going to gore the ox, then we should fall back to the idea of paying compensation. Where it says, if we're dealing with an idea that you're not going the ox, we're dealing with a compensation issue, am I low? So you should pay a compensation of the slave based on your own admission. So I can tell you, the beginning is talking about not paying money, and the end is talking about not paying a knas. But that's a very weak answer, because if we're talking about that you're not stoning the ox, or you're not dealing with the payments in the Torah, then they both should be talking about domim. And anyway, that's what the Gemara says. I'm not going to give you what I know is a bad answer. Okay, obviously they're both talking about the same issue. If the base is talking about paying compensation, that's the end. I divide domim. They're both talking about compensation. Miu says then now we're going to explain that this idea we just introduced, that when you're not paying kofar, you're going to pay domim, is true by a free person, but not true by a slave. Now, let me ask you about this, because this actually makes sense in a simpler way than the Gemara says it. Why do you think by a free person, if you don't pay kofar, you'll do compensation, but by a slave, if you don't do the shloshim shekel in the Torah, because the shore isn't gored, isn't stone, you would not pay compensation? You see how it would make more sense to say that there would be a fallback to pay compensation by a free person, but not by the slave? Any thoughts about that? By a free person, if you don't pay the kofar because you're not stoning the ox, the Gemara is going to say there would be a monetary payment to be paid. But by the eved, if you're not going to pay the shloshim shekel, there would not be a compensation to be paid. The Gemara will explain it in a minute, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Because the shloshim shekel of the Eved is the monetary payment. So why should you say, oh, if you don't pay the arbitrary monetary payment, we'll pay a real monetary payment? Like, if for whatever reason we're not doing the monetary payment the Torah signed, that's the end of it, right? But by the free person, if you're not doing the kofar, if you're not doing the criminal thing, then we can move on to the monetary payment. So that makes sense, but let's see now how the Gemara explains it. Meal. Ben chorin de mishalim kofar al piatzmo. There could be a case where in the case of a free person, you will pay kofar based on your own admission. How could that be possible if you can only pay kofar if the ox is going to be stoned, and you don't stone the ox based on the person's admission? By the following case. The hechi dami, what's the case? The azusadi v'asidu bei the katil. Witnesses said this ox gored and killed somebody. But they don't know if it's a tam or it's a muad. So right now, witnesses say it killed somebody, but we don't know tam or muad. What would be the halacha right now? What would you do to the ox? Stone it, because you stone an ox whether it's a tam or a muad. Would you pay kofar? No, because you don't know it's a muad. Everybody with me here? Yeah. The ox killed, so you with witnesses, because there are witnesses, you're going to stone the ox, but you're not going to pay kofar because you don't know if it's tam or muad. The Amar, okay, Mare, the master said, the muadhu. Oh, you know what? I'll admit it. It's a muad. The mishalim kofar al biatzmo. You're going to pay kofar on your own admission. Because why will you be paying kofar? Because the ox will be stoned. Because witnesses already testified that the ox is going to be stoned. But your admission made you pay kofar because you admitted it was a muad.
And you wanted the kapara. So
right.
He motivated to.
There you go. And kofar is not a knas. Okay. Therefore, since there are cases by an ox where you will pay kofar on your own admission, so if that's true, even if there are no witnesses, and there's not going to be a kapara, Michelle and Domim, at least you'll pay money, meaning somehow your own admission can obligate you in kofar by an ox in certain scenarios. So it has the power also to obligate you to pay money when there are no witnesses. You can never pay the knas by an evet on your own admission because it's always a motive knas. Okay? If witnesses testified that the ox gored, but we don't know tam or muad, and you admit that it was a muad, you'll never pay it. Even if you're goring, even if you're stoning the ox, you're never going to pay the knas al piatzmo. So since your own admission never has the power to obligate you in the prime payment that the Torah describes, so therefore, if there are no witnesses, you wouldn't pay money. So to me, I don't really get the connection, but whatever. To me, the logic makes a lot more sense. This difference for the reason we said, but the Gemara said by kofar, since your admission in some scenarios can obligate you, then even when there's not going to be kofar, there'll be dumb. By Eved, your admission will never obligate you in the shloshim, so therefore there will never be dumb by your own admission. Okay, whatever. Anyway, that's how we're now explaining it. There is dumbing to be paid when you're not doing the kofar, when you're not doing the whatever, when you're not doing the kofar, there is dumbing to be paid, but the kofar will only be when the ox is gored. Similarly, by the way, presumably here the difference was emphasized in terms of the guy's own admission. If the ox gores an evet shelo b'kavana, and we're saying you're not paying shloshim shekel, presumably if we have witnesses to that, maybe you would still pay dumbin by the evet. Right? Everybody are people with me here? The Gemara made a difference between whether your own admission can obligate you in dumbin by an evet or a free person. But what the Gemara has introduced is, number one, that all these payments, the payments in the Torah are linked to stoning the ox, and number two, that underlying them is a possibility to be paying compensation. And the same way that's true by a ben chorin, presumably it could be true by an evet too, if there are witnesses that the ox gored shelo b'kavana. All right, so we've introduced a lot of new ideas. Now the Gemara moves on. Okay, where were we? Masi Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak. Kol shechai b'ben chorin chai be'evet. We have a braita that says anytime you have to pay by a free person, you pay by a slave. Bein kofar, bein b'kofar, bein b'misa. Whether you're paying the kofar, whether you're goring the ox. So the Gemara says kofar be'evet mi'ika. 1 minute, you never pay kofar by a slave. What does it mean? Elolav dumming. It must be money. So here again, we're saying there would be an idea of compensation, whether in the case of evet or in the case of a ben chorin. And we're saying whenever you would pay one, you would pay the other. Whenever you would pay for a ben chorin, you pay for an evet. So if by your own admission you would pay compensation for a ben chorin, because you're not paying kofar by your own admission or whatever. You're not stoning the ox. You would also pay compensation by an eved. Okay, so we've been trying to say there's a difference. Your own admission would obligate you by a ben chorin and not by an eved. Here it says it's the same. So, Igadami, who mostiv lavu mafarikla. Some say he asked the question and he gave the answer. Igadami, Amarle Rabba answered it for him. Hachitkan. No. Here's how to read that right now. Kol shechai ben chorin b'kavana api edim kofer. Anytime you would pay by a free person kofer. When do you pay by a free person kofer? There was witnesses and it was with b'kavana. In that case, chayav be'eved knas. That was the parallel case. You would pay knas for an eved. There had to be witnesses and it had to be b'kavana. And if you would pay by a free person, you would pay compensation. How with witnesses? What would be a case you would pay compensation with witnesses? That the ox did it shalom b'kavana. So you're not going to stone the ox. You're still going to pay compensation.
But kavana lo b'kavana is not the same as tam or muad.
Correct. An ox is only chayiv if it gets stoned. It gets stoned if it's a tam, but only if it kills the person b'kavana. Right?
Yeah, I'm working it through. So if it's a tam and there are witnesses and it killed the person, but accidentally, there's no skila for
right.
it, sure.
Right. There's skila regardless of tam or muad, but it requires kavana. Okay? So chayav be'eved shelo b'kavana al piyedin damin. Okay? So therefore, by the slave too, if you're not going to pay the shloshim, you're going to pay the damin because in a case when you have witnesses. So what we are saying is, it's getting, I know, a little complicated. Maybe I should try to use this. Okay. Here's what we're saying. Okay. The Torah says, skila, kofer. Okay. This is ben chorin, right? It says skila and kofer. And by eved, it says skila and shloshim. And we are saying that they are linked. Okay. When you get one, you only get the other. Okay. So in a case of no witnesses, okay, which means no skila, okay, so therefore there's going to be no kofer, but there's going to be damin. We've introduced this new idea of damin by a free person. By the eved, there's going to be no shloshim. I'm sorry, no, we've already decided no skila. I guess I'll write like this. You don't have to write like this. There'll be no skila because there's no witnesses. So therefore, no kofer, okay, but there will be damin. And here too, there'll be no skila, because there's no witnesses, and therefore no shloshim, but there will be damin, which is quite interesting. Rather than paying 30 as an arbitrary price, you're now going to pay a real price of compensation. That's in the case of no witnesses, okay? So in case of witnesses,
No witnesses that you would pay.
Shalom b'kavana. Right. Oh, good point. But the point is here. The good point here. No witnesses, but you admit. Okay. So you're moda. Okay. So actually, logically, you should be paying dummy. In fact, I forgot that you should be paying dummy. That was the first question, but it said no dummy because your own admission is weaker here. Since this is a case of knas, fundamentally, it's a case of knas. Your own admission can't be mechayiv you, can't obligate. Okay, since it starts from a case of knas, so that's what's complicated the Gemara. It's like, shouldn't you be paying damin here? It said, well, since you can never obligate yourself in the base in the knas, your own admission can't obligate you here either. Right? Thank you. So that's actually the first part where got things confused.
Why would there be no obligation al piatzmo to pay damin?
What?
Like knas is one thing that's imposed by Beit Din, but you
Right.
there's still a monetary loss.
I understand, but that was whatever. I can't explain it. Since
Oh.
your own admission won't obligate you in the base case in the Torah, it won't obligate you in the fallback case either, even though this is a case of damin. That was the chiddush of the Gemara.
That's
But in
for
case of
slave.
witnesses,
That's for slave.
what?
That's just
That's for slave. That's
Right.
slave,
Right.
right? And this is free.
All right. And a free man, you would,
Yeah, done.
even by your own admission.
Okay, so witnesses shalom b'kavana also no skila, but there are witnesses. So no skila, no kofer, and yes damim. And here, right, no skila, no shloshim, but yes damim. Okay, here you would do damim because here it doesn't need to be your admission. The weakness here is your admission can't obligate you because it doesn't obligate you in the base case of the knas. So your admission can't obligate you in the dummy. Okay, but here you will be paying. In these cases, you will be paying the dummy. All right?
It's not al piazza.
Because it's not al piazza. All right? So basically, the Gemara is introduced. There's this new idea called tashlumim, which becomes the fallback when you cannot pay the payment in the Torah. Okay? And it would be true by Eved, and it would be true by Ben Chorin, and the only exception is the case of your own admission. Because the case of your own admission isn't powerful enough to make you pay by Eved, because you never pay the base knas by the case of your own admission. All right, so let's keep on going. So the Gemara says like this. Okay, so if you're going to pay compensation when it was with witnesses without kavanah, so also by case of a slave too, there are witnesses. It's shelo b'kavanah. You don't stone the ox. You don't pay the shloshim. You will pay the compensation. Okay, Amalei Rava Ihachi. If that's true, this is great. We've now introduced this new idea of paying compensation for a human life in a case where you're not doing the sort of initial payment in the Torah. So if that's true about an ox, what about the other avos nezikin? What about fire? What about a well? Well, you already know the answer about a well, because it's shor v'lo adam, chamor v'lo kalim. Humans are exempt by the case of the well, if you remember that, the death of a human. But what about a fire? Would you pay tashlumim if a fire takes a human life? Great question. Amalei Rava Ihachi Eisho Shelo B'Kavana Al Piedim Nishalim Damim. Let's say you're fired Shelo B'Kavana with witnesses. You should pay. Now, what does he mean Shelo B'Kavana? Tosa says it's lav dafka. We're assuming here Eisho is Mishum Mamono, not Mishum Chitzav. Okay, and if it's Mishum Mamono, if it's a type of a property of yours that damages, then the same way when your ox takes a life, if you're paying tashlumim, when your fire takes a life, even if it is b'kavana, because the whole reason you needed shelo b'kavana by the ox was to get it out of the kofir case. But by H, there's no kofir by H. Right? That's worth like taking a moment to appreciate. Your ox, you're seen as liable, fundamentally deserving of death. You're going to be a kapara. Like your fire, you would think you have more liability for, and the Torah never has a kofir for your fire. Your fire accidentally takes a life. So your fire, there's never kofir. At least you should pay compensation. At least you should pay tashlumim. Okay, is that true or not? So the Gemara says, why was Rabbi saying, oh, if that's true, then you would wind up doing that? Maybe you should. Why does he take it for granted that you don't pay when your fire takes a life? Okay, we talked in the Mishnah. You might remember this case. You have a bound up goat and a slave that's not bound standing next to a stack of grain. They were all burnt with a fire that you let forth. Okay, you're chayiv. Why? You pay for the goat because it couldn't run away. So obviously you're paying for age. You're not going to. The Eved could have run away, so you're not going to say Kimle or we not whatever. You're not going to be chayiv for the Eved. You're basically chayiv in that case for the goat. Eved kofut lo gdi samuch lo. Now, if the Eved was bound and the goat was nearby but not bound, v'nisaf imo pater. You're going to be exempt. You might be exempt even for the grain because of Kimle. That's a separate question about that. But anyway, right now we're focusing on the idea that you're exempt for the slave. So we're assuming, why are you exempt for the slave? It's your fire. Your fire took a human life. Well, because the Torah never has kofir by a fire, and presumably we think it doesn't have compensation for a human life. Now that's interesting. It wouldn't even have compensation for a human life of a slave, which we could just as easily look at as property and not look at as life. But Rav is now saying, why aren't you going to pay dunning here? Right? It seems like you're not going to pay compensation for a human life out of those special cases in the Torah.
So he's saying you're not paying compensation for a piece of property. That's the thing.
And that's why it's even a bigger chiddush. So how much more so should
it's
you?
more disturbing, but that's.
I understand. So, but it shows you there's never compensation for a human life. Okay. So Gemara says. So how could you say it's true here? It's not true over there by the fire case. So Gemara says 1 minute. No. That's not that your fire escaped. That's that you directly put your torch against the slave. You murdered the slave. So you're not paying because of Kimle. Okay? But if your fire escaped and took a human life, you would pay mamon. Okay? Yes, there's no kofar by fire. There is mamon. Gemara says, "V'elameha." So here's why Rava thinks that it's not possible for a fire, by the case of fire. Kitani, we turn to Bryce. Chomer be'esh mi bebor. An eish is more weightier than a bore in the case of stringent. A fire is considered liable when it destroys things that are fit for it or not fit for it. Remember, the not fit for it is like when it scorches ground, whatever. That's an abnormal thing you make a fire out of, or whatever. But a pit is exempt. It's exempt by kalim. It's exempt by people falling into it. It's exempt by certain things that are seen to be not normal. Okay, so that's the way in which a fire is weightier. So what Linzer says, but you had a great. Why did it go to that example? There was a much better example if what you're saying is true. It should have said, by fire you pay compensation for human life. By a well you don't, because the well we have the drasha shor v'lo adam chamor v'lo kalim. We know that a human life is fundamentally excluded by the case of the well. But if by a fire there is that compensation, that should have been a simple, powerful difference between fire and well, whether you would ever compensate a human life. So the Gemara's answer is, ton of a shear, fine, it was not a complete list, which is a very unsatisfying answer. Okay, so the Gemara says there's no proof that you don't pay compensation by fire. Why does Rava take it for granted that you don't? So the Gemara says, Ela Rava gufe ibai mi bayale. No, you misunderstood Rava. When Rava said, so then a fire should be paying for a human life, it was all in the tone of voice. He wasn't saying it as like astounded and challenging. It was a question. So are you saying that a fire should be paying for a human life? You see how much the tone of voice makes a difference? So Rava was asking this as a question, not as a challenge. Now that you're telling me there's an idea of compensation by an ox for human life, what about a fire? Maybe by an ox, the Torah starts by telling you there's going to be a type of a payment, a kofar payment. Then we can say, once the Torah has told you there'll be a payment for life, if you don't pay kofar, you'll pay compensation. But at least we started with the Torah telling me there is a payment. Aisha with kavana, you don't pay kofar. Now, again, what does that mean, b'kavana? You could just say it means you never pay kofar by H. The Torah never said kofar by H. Rashi also says here kavana means that you intentionally, burn somebody, you murdered somebody. Okay, but we're talking even in the case where you didn't directly light somebody afire. Your fire escapes. Okay, but even if there was some kavana, if you didn't directly torch somebody, there's never going to be kofar by H. The Torah never told you kofar by H. So since there's never kofar by H, shelo b'kavana nami lo mishalim damim. So maybe once the Torah doesn't have kofar, maybe for whatever reason, H is excluded from any type of a payment, even compensation. Dilma, or do we say kivin degabe shelo shelo b'kavana? No, let's not start with kofar. Let's just start. Forget kofar. Let's just start with the basic case of the ox paying compensation. An ox without kavana, afagav deleka kofar. In that case of an ox shelo b'kavana, there's no kofar in that case. It's shelo b'kavana. So it has nothing to do with kofar. And we say, mishalim damim, that an ox pays compensation in cases where there's no kofar. So gabe nami afagav delekavana lo mishalim kofar, by fire as well. Even though the Torah never has kofar by fire, shelo b'kavana miyas mishalim damim. Let's at least pay compensation by a fire. And we don't know, teku, and we leave it as unresolved. Now, the funny thing about all of this is, everybody, and it's like we got this by you didn't notice it, we have no scriptural basis to say that there's damim by the case of shor shelo b'kavana. The only thing the surah has is kofar and shloshim. The Gemara, to deal with the problem in a breita, because you're saying if you're not going to stone the ox, you're not going to do kofar, you're not going to do this, but the breita says you pay. The Gemara introduces out of nowhere the idea that there's going to be monetary payment. And then we're saying, can we learn fire from ox? You made the whole thing up to begin with. I mean, maybe it's true, but I'm just saying it's not like there's any pasuk that tells you that there's compensation for human life by the case of ox. So this Gemara is like huge idea. We've been talking about kofar, shloshim, etc. The Gemara puts on the table that when you're not paying those payments in the Torah, there will still be compensation for loss of human life. And as Tosfos points out, that might be the same amount as kofar, but might have significant different ways of conceptualizing it. And then it says, and that might not be limited to the case of an ox. It might be true by the case of fire as well, right? So even if when a human being causes loss of life directly, there's no compensation. When property causes loss of life, that's the question that we have here that we haven't like really fully worked out the parameters. Okay, so we will pick up with more of this tomorrow.